The knee hit first. That was how Marcus Webb would remember it later. Not the lights, not the voice, not the word that came out of Ray Pruitt's mouth like something he'd been carrying around for years and finally found an excuse to put down. The knee. The specific, deliberate weight of it dropping onto the center of his spine with the casual brutality of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again and had never once been made to reckon with either of those facts. But that came later. Before the knee, there was Elm Street at dusk and the smell of cut grass and a text message from his daughter. Marcus had been in the surveillance van for 6 hours when he stepped out onto the sidewalk and the evening air hit him the way evening air hits you. After a long stretch in a confined space with a sudden almost physical gratitude, the kind your lungs express before your brain catches up. He stood on the pavement for a moment and just breathed. The lawns of Pemberton Hills, Virginia stretched out in both directions, the specific aggressive green of grass that is professionally maintained on a schedule, and the houses behind those lawns were the kind of houses that communicated without saying anything exactly who was expected to live in them and who was expected to keep moving. He pulled out his phone before he started walking. There was a text from Simone, his 16-year-old, sent in the lowercase, no punctuation way she sent everything. As if capital letters were a formality, she'd decided to opt out of somewhere around age 13. Dad, you coming to my game Saturday? He looked at those 6 words for a moment longer than he needed to, standing next to an unmarked van with 3 monitors and a cold thermos of coffee waiting inside it. Then he typed back the only thing there was to type. Wouldn't miss it. He locked the screen and tucked the phone into the front pocket of his faded navy hoodie. He told his partner he'd be back in 15 minutes. Marcus Webb was 44 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades doing things that required both physical and mental discipline, and dressed in the kind of clothes that were specifically chosen to communicate. Nothing interesting. Dark jeans, worn, New Balance sneakers, a hoodie that had been washed so many times the color had faded from navy to something closer to an overcast sky. He walked with his hands loose at his sides. That was a 20-year habit. You kept your hands where they could see them in this work not because you were afraid, but because you had learned, starting at age 12 at a kitchen table in Baltimore, from a father who explained things without anger because anger was a luxury they couldn't afford, in that conversation that the world made faster, harder decisions about black men with their hands in their pockets than it did about anyone else, and Marcus Webb was a man who liked to control the pace of decisions. He was here because Lyle Beaumont lived in the white colonial at the end of the cul-de-sac. 6 bedrooms, a wine cellar, a boat at a marina 40 minutes south, and Lyle Beaumont had spent the last several years moving approximately $40 million in stolen pension funds through a network of shell companies that had taken Marcus and his team 3 years to map. The people whose money Beaumont had taken were not wealthy. They were teachers and county employees and factory workers who had paid into a retirement fund for 30 years, expecting it to be there when they needed it. Marcus had read their names in the case files. He thought about them sometimes when the work was long and slow, which was most of the time. He was 12 minutes into his walk, moving past the last of the sprinkler heads, shutting off for the evening when the hairs on the back of his neck came up. He didn't need to turn around. The low, deliberate idle of a police cruiser engine. Tires on pavement at walking speed. He had heard that sound before. He kept his eyes forward. He kept his breathing even. He kept walking. The Pemberton Hills Police Department had operated for 11 years under Captain Ray Pruitt, and in that time it had accumulated exactly 0 internal corruption convictions, not because the department was clean, but because it had never been seriously examined. The town's wealthiest residents liked Ray Pruitt for reasons they expressed in careful, polished language at city council meetings. He was tough, they said. He kept the neighborhood safe. He maintained standards. Everyone in Pemberton Hills understood what those words meant. Almost nobody said it plainly. Ray was 53, and he carried his weight the way certain men carry authority front-loaded deliberately as if his chest were a declaration. His face ran permanently flushed, the high color of a man with elevated blood pressure and a deep resistance to being told anything he didn't already believe. His uniform was pressed every morning with a precision that bordered on obsessive creases sharp enough to cut paper, brass polished to a mirror finish, but his boots were always scuffed, the leather dull and beaten. It was the detail of a man who cared intensely about how power looked, and very little about what it actually did. The gold signet ring on his right hand was the other thing people noticed once they'd been around Ray long enough to see the pattern. It was thick and heavy, with an engraving he'd never explained to anyone, and he tapped it on every hard surface when he was making a point. Desks, car hoods, the shoulders of subordinates he was correcting. It was the kind of unconscious habit that reveals everything the ring was not jewelry. It was punctuation. Officer Dana Briggs had been on the force for just under a year, and tonight was the first time she'd been assigned to ride with the captain himself, a fact she had been quietly proud of all week. She was 26, with the eager, slightly over-alert posture of someone who desperately wanted to be taken seriously by people who had not yet decided to take her seriously. She had spent 12 months absorbing the culture of the Pemberton Hills PD, the way you absorb the culture of any closed institution through proximity, through imitation, through learning what gets rewarded and what gets punished without anyone ever stating the rules directly. She spotted Marcus first, a black man in a hoodie walking alone through the most expensive street in Pemberton Hills at dusk. She reached for the radio before she had completed a single conscious thought about whether there was any reason to do so. Pruitt turned his head, slowly looked at Marcus's figure moving down the block and said nothing for a long moment. Then the gold ring tapped once on the dashboard, a single quiet sound, and he said, "Let's go have a word. Let's go have a..." Marcus heard the engine pace change before he heard anything else. The slight acceleration, the angle of the headlights shifting in his peripheral vision, and his body responded the way it had been responding to this particular configuration of events since he was a child. Not with panic, with calibration. His father had sat him down at the kitchen table in their house in Baltimore when Marcus was 12 years old and explained the rules with the quiet, careful precision of a man who had learned them through necessity and was now passing them on as armor. Move slow. Speak soft. Never reach for anything without asking first and waiting for the answer. Keep your hands where they can see them. Don't give them a reason. His father had said all of this without anger, which was the thing Marcus remembered most. The total absence of anger in his voice, as if anger were a luxury they couldn't afford in that conversation. As if the rules were just the rules. The way gravity is just gravity, and you don't argue with gravity, you just learn to move inside it. Marcus pivoted on his heel, slowly, both hands coming up and out to his sides, palms open and visible. Dana came out of the cruiser with her hand already on her holster knuckles, white, stopping 10 feet away with the posture of someone who had decided on a threat level before assessing the situation. Marcus registered this immediately. Disproportionate elevated no basis, and simultaneously registered that the SUV cutting across the road in front of the cruiser was not a standard patrol vehicle. The captain's. He made the calculation in the time it takes to exhale. He was deep in the final phase of the Beaumont investigation. 4 informants whose identities would be compromised in a public confrontation. A rookie officer with a trembling hand near a loaded weapon, and a man stepping out of the SUV with the unhurried swagger of someone who had never once been held accountable for anything. He would comply. He would get to the station. He would dismantle them from the inside legally with the full weight of the United States government at his back. It was not the choice he wanted to make. It was the right one. The man from the SUV stopped close enough that Marcus could smell stale coffee and wintergreen tobacco, and he spoke without introducing himself, without asking a question, without any of the procedural formality that was supposed to precede a stop like this. He simply used the word the way you use a word when you've used it 1,000 times, and no one has ever made you pay for it casually, almost lazily, as if it cost him nothing. Boy. Marcus placed his hands flat on the hood of the cruiser. The metal was warm from the engine. He thought about Simone's text. He breathed. What happened next took approximately 40 seconds, and Marcus cataloged every second of it with the detached precision of a man who understood that what he was experiencing was not just a personal injustice, but a body of evidence. Pruitt kicked his feet apart from behind the practiced motion of someone who had done this so many times. It required no thought, the sole of a boot hitting the inside of Marcus's ankle with a force that rocked his center of gravity forward. Dana grabbed his left arm and wrenched it behind his back, and the pain that shot through his shoulder socket was the particular white-hot pain of a joint being pushed past its design tolerance by someone who either didn't know or didn't care where the line was. Pruitt's forearm came down hard on the back of Marcus's neck, pressing his face toward the hood, and Marcus heard Pruitt say clearly and loudly, "Stop resisting!" The words perfectly disconnected from the reality of what was happening, like a stage direction read aloud in the middle of a performance. "I am not resisting," Marcus said. Then his legs were swept entirely. The world tipped 90 degrees. The asphalt came up to meet him with the indiscriminate violence of a surface that doesn't distinguish between people. His cheekbone hit the ground and opened immediately a sharp, bright pain that preceded the blood by about 2 seconds. The breath left his body from the impact, and then Pruitt's knee descended onto the center of his lower spine, not settling but dropping the full weight of a large man concentrated into a single point, and Marcus exhaled through his teeth and said nothing. At eye level with the asphalt, he could see Pruitt's boot 2 inches from his face, and beyond the boot, the gold signet ring catching the last of the evening light on the fist pressed against his neck. He filed it. He filed all of it. "I am a federal agent," Marcus said clearly, his voice entirely steady. "I am a federal agent, and I am complying fully." Pruitt laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a cover for doubt laugh. A genuine amused laugh, the laugh of a man who had heard every version of that line and had never once had to take it seriously. Dana laughed, because Pruitt laughed. Behind the thick trunk of an oak tree, 20-year-old Brianna pressed herself flat against the bark, her phone capturing every second in 4K. She heard the words, "Federal Agent," and her thumb froze over the stop button. She did not stop recording. The back of a police cruiser is designed with the psychology of powerlessness built into its architecture. The hard plastic seat shaped to prevent comfort, the plexiglass divider smudged and scratched the cage over the windows that turns the outside world into a grid of small squares. Every turn Pruitt took was 2 degrees sharper than it needed to be, sending Marcus's shoulders into the divider with the regularity of a deliberate rhythm. Marcus did not make a sound. He closed his eyes and began the breathing sequence he had learned at Quantico. 4 counts in 4 counts, hold 4 counts out, and his heart rate began its disciplined descent. He pushed the pain in his shoulder and the sting of the cut on his cheek into a corner of his mind and closed the door on it. Then he began to build. Badge numbers committed to memory. Cruiser designation Unit 7. Exact language used during the stop in sequence with approximate timestamps. The word Pruitt had used, boy, and the total absence of any probable cause. Any stated reason, any procedural justification for a stop that had begun the moment a white police captain had seen a black man walking on a street, he had decided black men did not belong on. In the front seat, Pruitt and Dana were debriefing the way athletes debrief after a good play loosely satisfied the adrenaline still working through their systems. And what struck Marcus listening through the divider was not the cruelty of what they were saying, but the casualness of it. They were not celebrating catching a criminal. They were experiencing professional satisfaction. Pruitt wasn't performing villainy. He was doing his job as he understood his job to be. That was the part Marcus would remember longest, not the anger. The comfort. Dana asked no questions. She had learned not to. Marcus thought about the gold ring. He thought about the comfort in Pruitt's voice, and he thought, this is not the first time. This is a pattern so old it has worn grooves in the asphalt, and patterns documented, evidenced, witnessed on a $4,000 phone camera by a college student behind an oak tree were federal cases. In the FBI Regional Field Office 40 minutes east, Supervisory Special Agent Carla Moss was looking at a timer that had turned red. Carla was 46, Marcus's partner for 10 years before she moved to command, and she knew his rhythms, the way you know the rhythms of someone you have trusted your life to. Marcus checked in every 60 minutes during surveillance. He had never missed a check-in by more than 90 seconds. The timer was now showing 4 minutes and 30 seconds past the mark. She had his GPS tracked. He was moving east at 45 miles per hour in a vehicle that was not his van. She called the Pemberton Hills precinct. The desk sergeant heard the words, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and said, "Yeah, right, and I'm the Queen of England," and hung up. Carla looked at the phone in her hand for approximately 1 second. Then she looked at her tactical lieutenant and said 4 words in the tone of voice that cleared the bullpen instantly. "Get the team up." The booking room of the Pemberton Hills Police Department was lit with the particular harshness of fluorescent lights that had not been replaced in several years, and it smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee and the specific institutional staleness of a room where bad things happened routinely enough that the air had absorbed them. Marcus was shoved against the booking counter, his wrists still cuffed, the cut on his cheek dried and pulling tight against his skin. Pruitt reached into Marcus's pocket himself and pulled out the wallet. He flipped it open with the practiced ease of a man who had searched thousands of wallets and expected to find the usual things. The gold federal shield caught the fluorescent light and sent it back across the room with the unmistakable authority of genuine federal credentials. The booking room went quiet the way a room goes quiet when everyone has simultaneously understood that something irreversible has just happened. The desk sergeant stopped chewing his gum. Dana took a breath in and did not release it for a moment, and her face went through 3 distinct phases in about 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then a slow dawning horror that had nothing to do with Marcus and everything to do with what she had just participated in. She looked at the badge for longer than Pruitt did. She looked at the photograph, then at Marcus's face, then at the badge again. Something moved in her expression, not quite conscience, but the beginning of it, the first uncomfortable stirring of a person who has done something and is starting to understand what that something was. She took a half step backward away from Pruitt almost without realizing she had done it. "Captain," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "That's Captain, that's a federal badge." Pruitt looked at the shield. He looked at the DOJ identification card with the holographic overlay and the barcode and Marcus's photograph staring back at him with the patient expression of a man who had been expecting this moment for the last 45 minutes. And then, because Ray Pruitt was a man whose ego had been his operating system for 53 years and had never once crashed, he did the thing that a smaller, smarter ego would never have done. He laughed. Not a cover-for-fear laugh. The genuine incredulous laugh of a man whose worldview had encountered evidence it could not metabolize. He dropped the wallet on the counter like it was a prop from a joke store. He called it tin from the internet. He called it cute. He added felony impersonation of a federal officer to the charges, doubling down on the asphalt when the rational move was to reverse off it entirely. The gold ring tapped the booking counter. Twice. His tell. Marcus looked at Pruitt the way a scientist looks at a specimen, not with contempt, not with anger, but with the detached clinical attention of someone who is observing and recording. He gave Pruitt the DOJ verification number on the back of the badge. He described in plain language exactly what would happen in the next several hours if Pruitt chose to cross the threshold of putting him in a cell, not as a threat, but as a professional courtesy, the kind you extend once to someone who still has the option to make a better choice. His voice did not rise. Dana heard something in that voice that Pruitt could not hear, the specific tone of a man who does not need to perform certainty because he actually has it. She stood very still, her hand not near her holster anymore, her eyes moving between the badge and Marcus's face in the captain's back. She thought about saying something else. She looked at Pruitt's posture, the certainty in it, the absolute absence of doubt, and she stayed quiet. That silence would cost her 18 months. She didn't know that yet. Pruitt ordered Marcus stripped and placed in the freezing holding cell. The steel door at the end of the hall swung open. Marcus walked through it without resistance, without looking back, and the door closed behind him with the heavy, resonant finality of something that cannot be undone. He put his boots on the mahogany desk, a habit so ingrained he did it without thinking, a man claiming space because claiming space was what he did. He opened his incident report template and began to type, and the report he wrote had very little relationship to what had actually happened on Elm Street, but it had a great deal of relationship to what Ray Pruitt needed to have happened, which was a different document entirely. He typed with 2 fingers slowly, the way a man types when he is also thinking about something else, and what he was thinking about was how satisfying it was when things worked the way they were supposed to work. A man out of place had been put back in place. The neighborhood was safe. The report would say resisting arrest, failure to comply, suspicious behavior, and those words would go into a file, and the file would go into a system that Ray Pruitt had been feeding for 11 years, and nothing would come of it, because nothing ever came of it, because this was Pemberton Hills, and Ray Pruitt ran Pemberton Hills, and that was simply how things were. The gold ring tapped the desk. 1, 2, 3. He did not know that across the county, 47 minutes east, federal vehicles were being loaded. He did not know that a college student's phone was uploading a 4K video to a server. He did not know that the timer on a monitor in an FBI field office had been read for 6 minutes, and that the woman watching that timer had already made 3 phone calls and used words like hostage and breach in the calm, flat tone of someone who uses those words professionally. He poured himself another cup of coffee from the carafe on his credenza. He took a sip. It had gone slightly cold, but he drank it anyway. He was in this moment entirely satisfied with himself. Outside, the last light was leaving Pemberton Hills. The cold in cell block 4 was not the casual cold of a thermostat set too low. It was structural cold, the cold of a room built from poured concrete that had been absorbing chill for 30 years and releasing it upward through the floor in a slow, constant exhalation that started at the soles of your feet and worked its way into your ankles and your knees, and eventually, if you stayed long enough, into the calcium of your bones. Marcus sat on the concrete slab in his undershirt and boxers. They had taken his hoodie, his jeans, his sneakers, his socks, everything with the thoroughness of an institution that understands that clothing is dignity, and the removal of clothing is a form of communication, and he placed his bare feet flat on the floor and felt the cold move into him and did not move in response to it. His shoulder ached where Dana had wrenched it. The cut on his cheek had dried and was pulling now, a tight, specific discomfort that spiked every time he turned his head. The single caged fluorescent bulb above him flickered on a cycle he timed at 40 seconds between each flutter. The rusted toilet on the left wall dripped every 11 seconds. He counted. You counted things in a small space because counting was ownership of time, and ownership of time was the one thing they couldn't actually take. He did not pace. He did not yell for a lawyer. He did not bang on the reinforced glass of the door. He sat perfectly still in the center of the slab with his arms folded loosely across his torso for warmth, and he breathed and he thought and he waited. He thought about Simone's text. Wouldn't miss it. He did not allow himself to calculate whether he would be out by Saturday. That calculation led to a door he didn't want to open in a cold room with no shoes on, so he shut it and focused instead on the single most important thing Carla Moss knew: his patterns. Carla had seen the timer turn red. Carla had already moved. The voice came from across the narrow corridor, raspy and low. A man pressing his face to the reinforced glass of the opposite cell and speaking in the careful volume of someone who had learned not to attract attention from the guards. His name was Darnell. He was 38, a mechanic, and he had been in cell block 4 for 6 days on a civil asset forfeiture hold stemming from what he described with the exhausted matter-of-factness of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything as a single joint in the ashtray of his truck. The truck, a 2019 Ford F-15. Oh, that was his livelihood that he used to haul equipment to job sites that his wife had helped him pay off over 3 years, was currently in the Pemberton Hills impound lot. His boss had called twice. His wife thought he was still at work. Darnell laid all of this out without self-pity, which was the most devastating way to lay it out, and Marcus listened to every word and filed it carefully. Darnell wasn't a plot point in someone else's story. He was the proof that what Ray Pruitt had done to a federal agent tonight was the same thing he had been doing to people who didn't have a federal badge, just with less documentation and no consequence. The difference between Marcus and Darnell was not innocence. It was the gold shield in a leather wallet on a booking counter 2 corridors away. "This is just what Pemberton Hills does," Darnell said, not bitterly, just as a statement of observed fact, the way you describe weather in a place you've lived long enough to know. Marcus looked at him through the glass for a moment. "Not for much longer," he said quietly. He closed his eyes and continued to wait. Down the hall in his office with his boots on his mahogany desk, Ray Pruitt was finishing his second cup of cold coffee. The gold ring tapped the desk in its unconscious rhythm. He had approximately 90 minutes left as a man whose authority meant anything at all in this building, and he was spending them entirely satisfied with himself, which was in its own way the most fitting thing that could have been said about him. Brianna had watched the footage 4 times before she allowed herself to make a decision, and each time she watched it, she paused on the same frame, Marcus's face pressed against the asphalt with Pruitt's knee on his spine, turned slightly toward the street. She had expected to see fear in those eyes, or pain, or the desperate, wild look of someone who doesn't understand what's happening to them. Instead, she saw something she didn't have an immediate word for. A cold, contained intelligence, the eyes of someone who was watching and recording and waiting. Someone who knew exactly what was happening and had already decided how it was going to end. Whatever he was not afraid of these men. That steadiness in a man being ground into the asphalt of a Pemberton Hills street unlocked something in her that the footage itself hadn't quite reached. But she sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before she moved. Everyone in Pemberton Hills who wasn't wealthy knew Ray Pruitt's name, the way you know the name of a serious weather system. You tracked it, you stayed out of its way when you could. She was 20 years old. She had a scholarship, She had a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital 30 minutes north and called every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock to ask if she was eating enough. She had a future that was fragile in the way all carefully built futures are fragile when you are young and have very little margin for the kind of trouble that happens when you cross men like Ray Pruitt. The temptation to delete the video was real, and she didn't shame herself for feeling it. She sat with it for several minutes, long enough to really feel the weight of both choices, long enough to understand that the world was not going to reward her automatically for doing the right thing. She understood all of that clearly. Then she thought about the man's eyes again. She thought about Darnell's truck in the impound lot. She didn't know Darnell specifically, but she knew a dozen versions of Darnell, men and women whose cars had been taken, whose sons had been roughed up for walking too slowly, whose complaints had gone to a department that investigated itself and found nothing concerning. She had grown up knowing that the cost of silence was also real. It just got paid by other people. She created the burner account. She typed the caption with shaking hands. She tagged the FBI, the DOJ, the state governor, and 3 national journalists. She hovered over the post button for a full 10 seconds, feeling every version of what might happen next. She clicked. The first 12 minutes were silence. Then a prominent civil rights attorney with a following that numbered in the millions, a man who had been doing this work for 30 years and had learned to recognize raw injustice in the first 5 seconds of any clip, retweeted the video with a single line, "This is a kidnapping under color of law." Someone identify these officers immediately. The dam broke. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. News desks in D.C. and Atlanta and New York sent direct messages to the burner account. Brianna sat in her desk chair watching the counter spin, and her hands were shaking again, but differently now, not from fear, from the specific vertigo of watching something you did begin to move faster and larger than you can contain. And 2 blocks away in his office, with his boots on his mahogany desk, Ray Pruitt finished typing his falsified arrest report, saved the document, and leaned back in his chair with the deep, uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who believed he had just had a very good evening. The view counter on Brianna's video passed 400,000. He did not know it existed. He poured himself one more cup of coffee and hummed something tuneless and tapped his gold ring on the desk. And outside his window the last of the Pemberton Hills evening light gave way to full dark, and somewhere in the dark, 3 Bearcat armored vehicles were turning onto the interstate. U.S. Attorney Patricia Owens had been asleep for 40 minutes when the secure line woke her, and she had the practiced skill of someone who had taken enough middle-of-the-night calls to be fully functional in 30 seconds. She listened to Carla's briefing without interrupting. Carla gave it the way she gave everything, organized and fast and without ornamentation. And when Carla finished, Patricia asked one question. "Do you have a tactical team ready?" "Already moving," Carla said. Patricia formally declared it a federal hostage situation, and in doing so, she set in motion a machinery that small-town police captains do not understand the scale of until it is landing on their rooftops. 3 Bearcat armored vehicles, a Black Hawk helicopter providing aerial overwatch, 20 members of the FBI's hostage rescue team, the most highly trained tactical unit in federal law enforcement. The full weight of the United States Department of Justice pivoting toward a municipal police station in a wealthy Virginia suburb that had never not once been looked at twice by anyone with real authority. Carla rode in the front seat of the lead SUV, her FBI raid jacket zipped her badge on her belt. The highway moving beneath them at a speed that turned the roadside lights into a continuous blur. For a moment, just a moment in the space between 2 radio transmissions, she let herself stop being the commander and be the partner. 3 years ago, Marcus had pulled her out of a situation that should have ended her career. A case had gone sideways in ways she hadn't anticipated, and Marcus had been the one who saw it coming, who positioned himself without being asked, who handed her the out she needed without ever mentioning it afterward. Not once. He had never used it, never let it become a thing between them. He had just done it and moved on the way you do things for people you trust completely, without needing anything in return. She looked at the blinking green dot on the GPS screen, Marcus's phone stationary inside the perimeter of the Pemberton Hills Police Department, and thought he waited for me then. He is waiting now. She keyed the radio. "All units, weapons hot. We are taking the station." The residents of Pemberton Hills felt it before they heard it. A low-frequency vibration that moved through the floors of their expensive houses and rattled the wine glasses on their carefully arranged shelves and sent their dogs into a sudden frantic alertness that their owners couldn't immediately explain. It was the kind of vibration that bypasses the ears and communicates directly with the part of the brain that is older than language. The part that registers something large is happening nearby before the conscious mind has assembled enough information to name it. Then the rotor wash hit. The full-throated industrial thunder of a Black Hawk descending below 500 feet over a residential neighborhood, its searchlight snapping on and turning the facade of the Pemberton Hills Police Department into a stage lit for a performance nobody in the building had consented to perform. The American flags on the front of the building whipped into a horizontal frenzy. Loose gravel became projectiles. A car alarm triggered and was immediately irrelevant. The Bearcats came around the corner of Main Street in a formation that communicated unambiguously that the normal rules of traffic and propriety had been suspended. The lead vehicle did not use the driveway. It hopped the curb at speed and tore 2 deep muddy trenches through the pristine front lawn of the police station. Lawn the city of Pemberton Hills paid $400 a month to maintain, and came to a stop with its reinforced bumper 18 inches from the glass front doors. The other 2 vehicles flanked the building, sealing the exits with rolled steel and ballistic glass, creating a perimeter that was not a suggestion. Inside, the atmosphere of casual authority evaporated in an instant. Dana was at a filing cabinet when the building began to shake. She dropped the folder she was holding without processing that she had dropped it. She pressed her face to the reinforced front window and saw the shapes moving in the white beam of the searchlight, dark figures in heavy gear moving with a synchronized, purposeful precision that her brain immediately recognized as categorically different from anything she had encountered in 12 months on this force. She saw the letters on their chests. She stepped back from the window. Her hand moved toward her holster, and then stopped because some part of her that was smarter than the rest of her had already understood what was happening, and understood that reaching for that holster was the worst decision she could make. The desk sergeant's hands went straight up before anyone told him to raise them. The charge on the center hinge of the reinforced doors was localized and specific, a hard concussive boom that sent the doors off their frames and into the lobby in a cloud of pulverized drywall and smoke. And before the debris finished settling, the HRT operators were through the gap and moving, filling the room the way water fills a low space. Red laser sights cutting through the smoke, acquiring targets. "Federal agents, do not move. Hands, now." The commands were loud, overlapping, calibrated to overwhelm the decision-making capacity of anyone in the room. It worked. The desk sergeant was on his knees before the sentence was finished. Dana's hands went up. The laser dot between her eyes did not move. A rifle barrel close enough to touch. She let out a sound that was not quite a word, and the zip ties went on her wrists, biting into her skin exactly the way Marcus's cuffs had bitten into his. Down the hall, Ray Pruitt heard the boom. His coffee mug rattled. He heard screaming from the lobby. He stood up, adjusted his gun belt out of 20 years of muscle memory. threw open his office door, and his brain, heavily insulated by 11 years of absolute local authority, simply could not process what his eyes were showing him. So it sent his hand toward the gun, because that had always worked before. "Give me the excuse, Ray." Calm, female, from somewhere in the smoke. Not a command, not a warning. An invitation delivered with the specific, chilling confidence of someone who genuinely would not mind if he accepted it. "Draw it and see what happens." Carla Moss walked through the shattered entrance with her badge on her belt and her hand resting at her side, and she did not run. She did not need to run. She walked the walk of someone who has already won and is simply arriving to confirm it. The HRT operators parted for her. Ray Pruitt stood in his office doorway, 5 red laser dots on his chest, his throat, his forehead. 3 separate operators, 3 separate decisions waiting on one trigger pull that Pruitt was finally wise enough not to make. His hand rose slowly away from the holster. The flush in his cheeks faded to something closer to chalk. "That's what I thought," Carla said. "The gun taken, the taser taken, the radio taken." The gold captain's badge unclipped from his chest dropped into a cardboard evidence box, with a sound like something small and final. And then after Carla photographed it carefully on his hand, the gold signet ring was bagged and tagged as potential evidence of financial transactions. Pruitt looked at his bare finger and seemed for a moment not to recognize it. He went to his knees, not because anyone forced him, because there was nothing left holding him up. Carla moved down the hall to cell block 4. She jammed the brass key into the lock and turned it hard. The door swung open and the cold air hit her immediately, and she swung her flashlight and the beam found Marcus, sitting perfectly upright on the concrete slab, shivering slightly, arms folded for warmth, his cheek bruised and streaked with dried blood. His eyes were completely clear and unbroken. "Carla," he said. "I'm here," she said. She stepped inside and stripped off her FBI raid jacket and put it around his shoulders in one motion without preamble, the way you do things for people you don't need to narrate for. She reached into her pocket and produced his leather wallet taken from the evidence tray the moment they secured the booking room and held it open to the gold shield. Marcus took the badge with numb fingers. He traced the seal slowly, feeling the weight of it returning to him, not metaphorically, but physically, the specific density of the thing in his hand. He was not a victim in a freezing cell. He was a federal agent, returning to duty. "Darnell," Marcus said, nodding toward the cell across the corridor. "The man across the hall. His truck was illegally seized. Civil asset forfeiture, no probable cause. Add him to the Civil Rights Division pile." "Done," Carla said, already keying her radio. Darnell pressed his face to the glass of his cell and stared at the woman in the FBI jacket and the man now holding a federal badge, and his mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. They gave Marcus back his clothes from the evidence locker, the navy hoodie, the dark jeans, the worn sneakers, and he dressed with the methodical care of a man who understood that what came next required him to be entirely himself. He clipped his badge to his belt. He rolled his shoulders once, testing the ache. Then he walked back into the main bullpen of the Pemberton Hills Police Department. 17 officers knelt against the wall in a single unbroken line, hands zip-tied behind their backs, and they turned their heads when Marcus came through the door, and the silence in the room deepened in the way silence deepens when it has something to absorb. They recognized him. The recognition moved through the kneeling line like a slow wave. Dana, at the far end, turned her face toward her knees and kept it there. Marcus walked to the center of the room and stopped. He looked down at Ray Pruitt kneeling on his own bullpen floor, stripped of his badge and his gun and his ring, looking at the linoleum with the expression of a man who has finally arrived somewhere he cannot leave. Pruitt looked up, and whatever he expected to see in Marcus's face was not there. Marcus looked at him with the same calm, detached expression he had worn with his cheek on the asphalt. Patient, absolute. "I told you to make the call," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the room with no effort at all. "I gave you the number. I told you exactly what would happen. I was as clear as I could be." Pruitt's mouth moved. Nothing came out. "You didn't listen. So now we do this the full way." He placed the federal handcuffs on Pruitt himself and said the full Miranda, every syllable ending with, "I highly suggest you finally use it." And the cuffs went on. Mayor Gerald Sutton and Chief Warren Blake arrived 11 minutes later, coming through the shattered entrance in expensive suits thrown over pajamas, radiating the automatic indignation of men who expected the world to arrange itself around their comfort. Then they stopped. They took in the kneeling officers. They took in Pruitt in federal cuffs. Carla shoved a ruggedized tablet into the mayor's chest, the Elm Street video playing on a continuous loop, the view counter climbing in real time, CNN, and the Washington Post already running it on their front pages. Blake turned on Pruitt with an expression of pure, calculated disgust, 20 years of professional loyalty discarded in the time it takes to assess a liability, and called him an arrogant fool in a voice that made it sound like he'd been waiting years to say it. Marcus laid out the options for the mayor with the flat efficiency of a man explaining terms to someone who had already lost the negotiation. Fight the Department of Justice and be examined completely. Or sign the federal consent decree and begin the process of dismantling what Ray Pruitt had built. Sutton looked at the shattered doors, the federal rifles, the video, a view counter that was going to be on the front page of every newspaper in the country by morning. "Where do I sign?" he said, and his voice was the voice of a man whose political career had just ended and who had only now understood it. The sun came up over Pemberton Hills on a town that looked the same from the air and was entirely different on the ground. The lawns were still the aggressive, curated green of lawns that cost money to maintain. The houses were still large. But in front of the municipal police station, where a federal convoy had torn up the landscape in the dark, the grass was churned to mud, and the crime scene tape had turned the block into something the neighborhood had never conceived of happening here. Brianna stood behind the tape with a cup of coffee from the gas station around the corner watching. Next to her, without either of them having planned it, stood Darnell, released at 3 a.m. Charges cleared an FBI case number in his pocket for the civil suit. His truck had been in the impound lot and was returned to him by 6. He had the keys in his hand. He was still standing there. Some things you need to see with your own eyes before your mind will process them, and watching Ray Pruitt's officers marched out of the precinct in single file chains at wrists and ankles heads down was one of those things. The crowd that had gathered did not cheer. They watched in the weighted silence of people who have waited a long time for something and are not sure how to hold it now that it has arrived. Pruitt came last. 2 federal marshals, one on each arm. He kept his eyes on the concrete because there was nothing in the faces around him that he wanted to see. Marcus stood in the doorway of the shattered lobby and watched until the transport doors closed. Carla handed him a coffee. "It's a good look for them," she said. Marcus watched the transport pull away. "It is," he agreed. The financial reckoning arrived in the weeks that followed with the specific poetic justice of consequences that fall on exactly the people who deserve them. The $12 million federal civil rights settlement required Pemberton Hills to raise property taxes on the estates whose owners had benefited most directly from Ray Pruitt's version of neighborhood safety. The people who had paid for the protection paid for the price of it. The Homeowners Association sent no letters. There were no violations to note. There was only the quiet arithmetic of accountability working itself out on a spreadsheet in the city manager's office. Marcus donated his personal portion to a national legal defense fund for people fighting false arrests and civil asset forfeiture cases. He did it without ceremony, without a press release, without telling anyone except his accountant and Carla. 6 weeks after the night on Elm Street, Lyle Beaumont was taken into federal custody at the marina, where he kept his boat on 19 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. The 3-year racketeering case. The reason Marcus had been in a surveillance van in Pemberton Hills on a Tuesday evening. The reason he had been on that street at that particular hour reached its conclusion in a federal indictment that began the long process of recovering $40 million from teachers and factory workers and county employees who had paid into a retirement fund expecting it to be there. Marcus was not in the room when Beaumont was arrested. He was in his daughter Simone's high school gymnasium, sitting in the 3rd row of the bleachers, watching her play basketball with the focused attention of a man who has decided that this is the most important thing happening anywhere in the world right now. He had not missed it. He had promised he wouldn't. His phone buzzed in the 3rd quarter. He felt it in his pocket and did not look at it. At halftime, he checked Carla, 2 words and a period, Beaumont's in custody. You did good. He typed a thumbs up, put the phone away, and watched Simone score on a fast break in the first 2 minutes of the second half and stood up in the bleachers and made enough noise that the people around him turned to look. The retirees whose money had been taken would begin the recovery process. It would be slow and imperfect, as these things always are. But it had begun because Marcus Webb had spent 3 years building a case, and because a girl named Brianna had pressed record behind an oak tree, and because a mechanic named Darnell had been sitting in a cold cell and told the truth about what Pemberton Hills had been doing to people like them. Marcus watched his daughter play and did not look at his phone again until the final buzzer. The federal courthouse in downtown Richmond had the specific, serious atmosphere of a building that has witnessed enough genuine consequence to have absorbed it into its architecture marble floors that sounded different when important things were happening. Ceilings high enough to give weight to the words spoken beneath them, the federal seal behind the judge's bench, not as decoration, but as a reminder of something larger than the individuals in the room. The gallery was full. Every seat. Front row Marcus in a charcoal suit badge on his belt, sitting with the still contained energy of a man who has nothing to perform here. Carla beside him. 2 seats over Darnell and his wife, who had driven down from Pemberton Hills that morning because Darnell had told her he needed to see it, and she had said, "Then we go," and they had gone. 3rd row. Brianna, phone off, hands folded, an expression of careful, focused attention on her face. Dana Briggs had taken a plea deal, 18 months in federal prison, full cooperation agreement. She had testified against Pruitt fully once she understood the weight and permanence of what she had participated in. She was not in the courtroom. The script does not tell you how to feel about Dana Briggs. That work belongs to you. Ray Pruitt sat at the defense table in the clothes that federal detention had given him. Not the pressed uniform, not the polished brass, not the gold ring, and he looked like what he was now, a man held together for 11 years by a costume, and the costume was gone. His attorney had argued stress, decades of service, the impossible demands of modern policing, split-second decisions in a dangerous world. The jury had watched the video. They had heard Pruitt's laughter while Marcus said, "I am a federal agent," with a knee on his spine. They had deliberated for 4 hours and come back with guilty on every count. Judge Eleanor Vance had been a federal judge for 19 years, appointed after 2 decades as a federal prosecutor, and she had heard every version of "I was just doing my job" that the human voice was capable of producing. She sat behind the bench and looked at Ray Pruitt for a long moment before she spoke long enough that the silence itself became a statement, and when she began, she did not rush. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, and her voice was not angry. It was something more deliberate than angry. the measured, exhausted clarity of someone who has watched the same wheel turn for a very long time and finally has the power to stop it. You were trusted with something real. Not just a badge and a title, but the actual trust of the people in that community, including the people you believed didn't belong there. That trust was not yours to monetize, and it was not yours to weaponize, and yet you did both for more than a decade. She let that sit. I want to be specific, she continued. Because vagueness is how men like you survive these rooms. So let me be specific. On the night in question, you assaulted a federal officer who was exercising his right as a private citizen to walk on a public street. You did it because he was black and because you were 11 years into never being wrong. Those two things were always going to find each other. The only question was when. Pruitt stared at the table. His hands, folded in front of him, had stopped shaking. He had run out of energy for trembling. There was a man in the cell across from Agent Webb that night, Judge Vance said. His name is Darnell. He had been in that cell for 6 days because you took his truck on a pretext that would not have survived 30 seconds of legitimate legal scrutiny. He missed 6 days of work. He had to explain to his wife where he had been. He will never get those 6 days back. He is one of dozens. For people like Darnell, what you did on Elm Street was not a mistake in judgment. It was a Tuesday. She looked at Pruitt directly, and he did not look back. A 26-year-old woman is currently serving 18 months in federal prison because she absorbed your professional values in 12 months on the job. She was formed in your image. Whatever she becomes after this, that is also your work, Captain. And the gold ring? She said, and the gallery shifted almost imperceptibly at the specificity of it. We have documentation of cash payments tied to that ring over a period of 9 years. You were not simply a flawed officer operating under pressure. You had turned the public trust of this community into a personal revenue stream. The badge was never a symbol to you. It was a business license. She paused, and the courtroom held its breath. You pulled over the wrong man, Captain Pruitt, Judge Vance said, and her voice was quiet now, the kind of quiet that carries further than loud. But the truth that this trial has made undeniable is that there was never a right man to pull over. You simply finally ran out of people who couldn't fight back. For the federal offenses of deprivation of rights under color of law, kidnapping, aggravated assault, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud, I sentence you to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Your pension is revoked in full. The gold ring cataloged as evidence in the financial investigation will not be returned. The gavel came down. The sound filled the room. The U.S. Marshals approached from behind. The handcuffs went on Ray Pruitt's wrists with the specific mechanical sound of metal ratcheting tight. The same sound in the same register as the cuffs that had bitten into Marcus's wrists on Elm Street. Same sound, different wrists. The math of it was simple and total. Pruitt was turned around. He was walked toward the oak doors at the back of the courtroom. At the threshold, he looked back over his shoulder at the gallery, and his eyes found Marcus, the last face he looked at before the door closed behind him. Marcus did not smile. He did not look away. He held the same expression he had worn with his cheek on the asphalt patient, and absolute and entirely unbroken. I told you exactly what I was. The door closed. Ray Pruitt was gone. The letter arrived on a Thursday in a standard white envelope with a Howard University Law School return address, and Brianna read it standing in the hallway outside her dormitory room because she had not quite made it back inside before she recognized what it was. The Civil Rights Fellowship. Full scholarship. One of 12 awarded nationally each year to students who had demonstrated, and here she read the committee's language carefully twice, exceptional courage in documenting civil rights violations at meaningful personal risk. 4 years of law school funded. a summer fellowship between second and third year at a civil rights nonprofit in Washington. A cohort of 11 other people from around the country who had done something similar documented. Something said something stood behind an oak tree with shaking hands when the safer choice was to go back inside. She sat down on the floor of the hallway and read it again from the beginning. Then she called her mother. Her mother who worked double shifts. Her mother who had told Brianna to delete the video and stay out of it, not because she didn't care about justice, but because she had spent 43 years learning at considerable personal cost what happened to black women who put themselves between powerful men and the consequences of their actions. Her mother, who tracked every dollar of Brianna's scholarship and called every Sunday at 9 and asked if she was eating enough because that was the language she had for, "I love you, and I am afraid for you, and I need you to be okay." Brianna read the letter aloud over the phone, slowly, so her mother could hear every word. When she finished, there was a silence long enough that Brianna checked the call was still connected. Then her mother said very quietly, "Baby, read that again." Brianna pinned the letter above her desk that evening below a photograph she had printed of the oak tree on Elm Street, the tree she had stood behind with her hands shaking, and her mother's voice in the back of her mind telling her to be careful, and the steadiness in a stranger's eyes telling her something different. She was going to be a lawyer. She was going to be very, very good at it. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning in October, Darnell opened his garage at 7, the way he had opened it every working day for 11 years, sliding the wide door up on its tracks and stepping into the smell of motor oil and cold metal and the particular dusty warmth of a space that has been used consistently for honest work. His truck was in its usual spot along the far wall. His tools were where he had left them. The lift was empty and waiting. A customer came in at 7:30 with a Honda making a noise she described as like someone put a marble in a dryer. Turned out to be a loose heat shield on the exhaust, and they talked briefly about the weather while Darnell wrote up the ticket and she left and he got to work, and nobody said anything about the 6 days he had spent in cell block 4 or the week his wife had spent not knowing where he was, or the truck that had sat in a Pemberton Hills impound lot while his boss called and called. At lunch, his wife brought him a sandwich turkey on wheat, the same thing she had been bringing him since they got together 14 years ago, and they sat on the tailgate of the F-150 in the pale October sun and did not talk very much the way people sit together when they are grateful for ordinary things and don't need to say so out loud. A letter came that afternoon from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice confirming the settlement of his individual claim against the city of Pemberton Hills. The amount was not large. It was not the point. The letter stated in the careful formal language of federal correspondence that the practices which had led to his illegal detention had been formally ended under a federal consent decree, and that the city had entered into a legally binding agreement to reform its police department under federal oversight. Darnell read the letter standing at his workbench. He folded it in thirds and put it in the glove compartment of the truck, not because he needed to keep it safe, but because it belonged in that truck with him when he was going somewhere. He went back to work. The Honda was done by 3. He called the customer, and she came and picked it up and thanked him, and he said have a good one and meant it. He locked the garage at 5:30. He drove home. His wife had made dinner. It was a Tuesday. Nobody stopped him. That was the whole point. Marcus drove back to Pemberton Hills alone on a Saturday morning, 1 week after the sentencing, in his personal car. Not a government vehicle, no case open, no badge visible. He parked on Elm Street at the spot where the surveillance van used to sit. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment looking at the quiet, manicured street in the morning light. Then he got out of the car. He was wearing the same faded navy hoodie. He put one earbud in the jazz playlist from his phone, picked up where he'd left it 7 weeks ago, the same song that had been playing when he stepped out of the van on that Tuesday evening, and the world had been for approximately 12 minutes ordinary. He put his hands loose at his sides. He began to walk. The street looked exactly the same. The lawns were the same expensive green. A sprinkler system cut off with its usual hiss and tick as he passed. Somewhere on the block a dog barked once and went quiet. The morning air smelled of cut grass and the cool, clean beginning of a day that hadn't been complicated yet. He walked past the spot where the cruiser lights had hit him. He did not slow down. He did not look at the asphalt. He walked through it the way you walk through a place that tried to define you and found in the end that you were larger than its definition, not because you fought back harder, but because you knew who you were and held on to it in a cold cell for 2 hours until the cavalry came, and that turned out to be enough. He passed the oak tree where Brianna had stood with her phone in her shaking hands. He nodded at it slightly, a small, private acknowledgement to a 20-year-old woman who had understood in the moment that mattered, that some things are worth the risk. She was going to make a remarkable lawyer. He was certain of it. He reached the end of the cul-de-sac. Lyle Beaumont's white Colonial was dark and empty, a federal notice taped to the front door, the wine cellar locked and catalogued and waiting for the asset forfeiture proceedings to conclude. 3 years of his professional life had gone into that house and out the other side to $40 million and 400 people who deserved their retirement back. He looked at the notice on the door for a moment. Just a moment. Then he turned around. His phone buzzed in his hoodie pocket. Simone, in her usual lowercase. No ceremony, Dad. You were so embarrassing at my game. LOL. Everyone heard you. He stopped walking. He looked at the message, and something in his chest that had been held quietly tight for several weeks loosened just slightly in the October morning air. He typed back, "I'll work on being louder." He put the phone away and stood there for a moment on the quiet street, the jazz playing softly in one ear, and the sound of Pemberton Hills waking up in the other sprinklers, a distant lawnmower, the ordinary, unhurried sounds of a Saturday going about its business. He started walking back toward his car at the same easy pace. Hands loose at his sides, the same way he had walked down this street 7 weeks ago when it had all begun. It was a beautiful morning in Pemberton Hills, Virginia. The amber light was low and clean, and it fell on the manicured lawns and the enormous houses and the empty spot where Ray Pruitt's SUV used to sit, and Marcus Webb walked to the end of Elm Street and turned around and walked back. Nobody stopped him. If this story got under your skin, if it made you feel something real, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Justice doesn't always make the news. Sometimes it needs a little help finding its audience. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Every comment gets read. Tell us what part of this stayed with you.